Look, Julian's already here. Julian's a professor at Macquarie University, the Associate Dean International in the Faculty of Arts. He's also, some of you might vaguely remember Julian from Even As We Speak, where he's a guitarist, songwriter, and they're touring the UK again soon. So, erudite and groovy. So, but Julian has passionate ideas about tertiary education, particularly its commercialisation and the risks arising from it. But I'll shut up and welcome Professor Julian Knowles.
Thank you, Mark. I think it's really good that you do your own tech. It's very grounded. It's excellent. I'm going to talk to you about higher education and identifying some really clear problems that are going on in the sector right now that nobody's talking about that urgently need to be addressed. And I don't believe either of the two major parties has any intention of going near any of the biggest issues in higher education at the moment, because ultimately it's going to cost them some money, which will mean they'll have to start taxing people, and we all know how they feel about tax. So I just wanted to identify those real hotspots here, and this comes from, I've been working in this sector now for 25 years, so my superannuation plan says. That's a fair time to be getting a resolved view of it. I've been a head of school at 4 Australian universities, and I'm currently working at Associate Dean level, so also at that sort of level of the university where you're seeing the flight deck of these things, and you've got a real sense of the way in which policy intersects with these entities and makes it either hard or easy for them to operate. So I'm going to go through 4 hotspots that I think are currently going on. So I would argue that there is an imminent funding crisis in higher education, that there are unsustainable and misguided approach to funding the sector. And I'll talk about that in a moment. I'll also say that there's unprecedented ministerial interference and politicisation of Australia's research funding and innovation system, which really needs to stop. There are efforts to politicise Australian universities with ideological projects, such as the Ramsay Centre. That's got to stop. And there's some fundamentally really boneheaded and poor decisions on access and equity into the higher education sector, and is an ecology through the sort of vet system, through to the university system and so on. It's been very poorly conceived and managed in my view. So there's really obvious problems going on. So I'm going to give you a quick primer about how universities get their money, because I think it's quite interesting. So as you probably know, universities receive base funding allocations from the federal government, and that's primarily for the teaching of students. But this comes nowhere near the actual cost of teaching those students. Now, we also know that we have HECS, which was brought in under Labor actually, which is quite surprising, but goes some way to addressing that difference between what it costs to teach a student and what you receive from the Commonwealth in funding. So there's a significant gap that remains between the revenue that comes in from those two sources and the actual costs of actually teaching the students. And how is that cost met? Well, it has to be met from earned income. And the only way that universities have really worked out to earn a lot of money is from international student revenue. Okay, it's the obvious area in which people are able to, which universities are able to earn revenue independently. So this has, I would argue, well, not argue, I think the facts are there that international student fee income effectively runs Australian universities. Just to give you a bit of an idea, a lot of the major metropolitan universities, so this is a statistic that you won't hear, but I'm here to tell you, a lot of the major metro universities, around 30 to 40% of their entire operating income comes from international student fee income. Right? 30 to 40% of that. So that's like 1 in 3 staff members that's in front of the students. 1 in 3 buildings, 1 in 3 units that gets taught, 1 in 3 degree programs. You can think of it any way, but that's only, so basically 1/3 of the university or more is funded from this earned income. Second statistic is that more than half of that income comes from one country, which is China. Okay. So China overwhelmingly has the largest number of students who are in pursuit of an international education in the world. So that's typical, that's not unusual for Australia, that's just the way the international student market looks. And then, quite a long way behind that, it's still huge, is India and South Asia. And then Southeast Asia is significant as well. But so if you looked at it like a share market and you're saying, okay, so we are effectively exposed to this share market to the tune of 30 to 40% of our entire revenue. And in fact, half of that is from one stock that we're holding, which is China. And we know that the way that things are going in China is that they are on a trajectory out of international education because they are investing heavily in their own education infrastructure, they're buying back all their talent from overseas. That income is going to drop off. So there's a cliff that the sector is actually driving towards a massive cliff. Okay, because once that revenue goes, what's going to happen? It's going to be like, mass layoffs, course closures. What's going to happen to the system? I mean, it doesn't look like either side of government's prepared to put money into it. So it's just a cliff that we're going to drive off. So I think there needs to be funding review. As a result of this, Australia has become one of the world's most aggressive marketers of international education in the world. We also know that education is Australia's third largest export industry. So it was worth 23.6 billion in 2017. Now, that's a big number and that's great. And I think, look, it is fantastic for us to be net exporters of education, predicated on the fact, well, one hopes that we have a quality education system that other people feel is high enough quality to want to, enrol in, that may be superior to some of the opportunities that they might have in their home countries. But the problem is that it's well beyond this sort of situation of, well, okay, we've got a way of being able to accept international students on a fair paying basis. It's that pretty much a lot of universities are going to take anyone that breathes and it's got a pulse. Because they have to. Because there's no money. Okay? And I think that causes huge problems. So, for example, in some of the large group of 8 universities, in particular disciplines, like in accounting and finance, you will find that 90% of the student cohort is from China. Okay? What sort of an experience is that for the Chinese students, let alone anyone else? I mean, why would you go to Australia and study in a class full of everyone from your own country? I mean, it just doesn't really make sense. From a diversity point of view, it doesn't make sense. What looks like good education to me is if we have a spread of people from all around the world, that we're not sort of beholden to one group of buyers in order to, literally in order to just sort of hold the whole thing up. So there's real questions now that are sort of bubbling around from the sector about things like the student experience, okay? And I think, it does cut into you're kidding yourself if you don't think that this actually cuts into the student experience for all students, not just international students, but also for domestic students. So I think it's this dependency that's the problem. This is the problem, is that universities will go broke if they don't chase this money. Okay, and I think funding review and a thorough review of undergraduate taught load funding needs to happen in the universities so that we're not beholden to this in order to survive. You look at Germany. When you go to Germany, you go to university, it costs you nothing. Okay, so the German government has managed to work out how to run a high-quality university system without charging the students and without forcing their university system to go out and earn most of their money from the international student market. So, in terms of a developed Western economy, we're right down that end of the spectrum where we're being forced into earning this money. And we're a little bit different from the US because, the US, as we know, which is kind of the home of inequality, they just have massive university fees for domestic students. Okay, so they're charging 40 to 70,000 US per year per student for domestic students. Okay, but in Australia, we have HECS, which is a modest contribution, which is good that it's not huge, but it means there's a huge gap, all right? So the American institutions can get by because they're charging massive amounts of money to domestic students, which means they're basically teaching wealthy students, okay? Which is not the system that I think we want in this country, but it explains why they're able to do it, okay? It's just a kind of the way the ecology is. So I think that means that there needs to be, you know, a thorough review. And then I wanted to just touch on a couple of other things before, you know, in the available time. So I mentioned before about this unprecedented levels of ministerial interference in things like the research funding system. You know, I mean, it's without a doubt that this kind of interference is ideological in nature. So you may or may not know, but under the previous Minister, Simon Birmingham for Education, he refused to sign off on $4.2 million worth of research grants in the last round. All of those grants were from the arts and humanities. Okay? None of the science and tech, engineering, medicine, none of the STEM ones were touched. It was all singled out from the arts and humanities. And so it's a kind of culture war that's being affected here, you know, because we all know, don't we, that the arts and humanities is the home of leftism in Australia, isn't it? You know, I mean, they're to be minimised. And this guy doesn't have a PhD. He's got no research expertise background. He doesn't hold the minimum entry-level, you know, qualification, i.e. a PhD, to even begin a research career, and he's there striking off grant proposals that have gone through a full 6 months worth of rigorous peer review, 50 to 60 page applications, and have been recommended by the Australian Research Council to him, and it's understood he just needs to go, yes, budget is available, but he drew a line through them. And his comment was, he didn't say anything, it was kept secret. The applicants were told that they were unsuccessful because their applications were not good enough. And then 3 months later, when it came out as an expose, he admitted that he'd drawn a line through them, and when asked why that was, he said, I didn't think they represented good value for taxpayers' dollars. That was it. End of story. So there needs to be a principle where the minister can't just jump in and intervene in the research ecology on ideological grounds. Kim Carr has said that he would introduce the requirement for the minister to say why they had not funded something, but not that they would to actually be hands off and allow the Australian Research Council to do its job. So that's a big problem. And then the last thing that I want to mention is, and connect it up quickly to the problems with funding, is that, you know, these revenue holes and this kind of absolute need to kind of fill in the hole in the bottom line leads to universities being vulnerable to approaches from people with lots of money but may have some fairly dubious, motives and backgrounds. And the thing that I wanted to mention there is the Ramsay Centre, which some of you may have followed, which is a philanthropic organisation. Two of its most famous board members are Tony Abbott and John Howard. And it has big buckets of money to start what they call degrees in Western civilisation in Australian universities, where they would have control over the curriculum, the board. And it comes with a $50 million funding allocation. And they're walking around with $50 million cheques to the universities and saying, we would like to start a Ramsay Centre and a degree in Western civilisation. Here we have, we will give you $50 million to start that centre. And ANU was approached, they said no. Sydney is in discussion. University of Wollongong took it, so they're starting one. University of Queensland is in discussion. I hear it on the grapevine, it's likely to happen up there. Okay, and they're saying, well, this is the only chance that the arts and humanities have got to survive it. Right? Grants are getting written off by the minister. You know, the cheques are being held over here to keep them going by people with dubious interests. It's a mess, right? It's a complete mess. So this really needs to stop. So, it's the same sort of thing. These they're almost like political donations, but the idea is to transplant, conservative think tanks in the form of degrees and philanthropically funded into the undergraduate system in Australia to grow the new generation of Conservatives. So it's dangerous times that we live in. Anyway, that's all I have to say. I should get off and move on. Thank you.